All right, good morning and welcome to Counterpoints. I do have to warn everybody, Emily came in here fired up this morning. I think she miscalculated on her microdose a little bit, so this is going to be a very, very interesting show. It's also going to be interesting because we're going to be talking about the
macrodose.
Yes, it became a macrodose, so look out. So we're going to be talking about the UAW, which has set a noon deadline for its upcoming negotiations. It could be an expansion of the strike coming. Zelensky was here. President Biden spoke at the United Nations. We're going to go through that. Got some new news on Pakistan and Ukraine, the IMF, that we'll talk about later. Absolute faceplant by Republicans in the House. Yeah, we're not going to talk about these special elections, but I think they're related to this. So last night, Republicans lost a special election in a Trump district in New Hampshire, which puts them one seat away from flipping the New Hampshire House of Representatives. And Democrats also won a Pittsburgh area special election for State House there, which gives Democrats control of the Pennsylvania State House. All of this happening while Republicans just kind of fell to pieces in a pretty hilarious way in the House yesterday.
Yeah, there was some fun on Capitol Hill. We're going to go through it. We have some really good clips, so stay tuned for that. We're actually going to be talking about YouTube's decision to demonetize Russell Brand. So surely you've followed the allegations against Russell Brand, but YouTube took a pretty serious step in demonetizing his channel. So we'll get to that. I'm going to talk about alleged plans among, actually it's not alleged because they came out and told Jeff Stein of the Washington Post that they're planning a big corporate tax cut if Donald Trump gets in office again, and then Republicans have the House and the Senate. And Ryan, you have a little bit of a scoop to talk to us about the RNC debate. Yeah,
Rumble versus Google. And we'll talk about that. But essentially, Rumble had the exclusive streaming rights for the last Republican debate, but they were nowhere to be found, certainly on the front page of Google search results, even though, and I'll report on this, Google and Rumble were in contact ahead of time. So interesting stuff there, especially as Google is kind of currently in a trial, in an antitrust trial. Yes. Like it's ongoing at the moment.
Well, let's start with news from the UAW strike. Actually, Ryan over at The Intercept, there's a great news story this morning with details about a truly hilarious development and a big development too. Tell us what happened.
Really love it. So yeah, we can put up this first element. Daniel Boguslaw, a colleague of mine, confused automakers braced for strike at the wrong plants. And so check out his piece. The whole thing is worth a read. But for people who are new to this kind of new tactic that's going on in labor, because they're striking all three automakers, and because the supply lines are so spread out, what the union is trying to do is strike as few places along that supply chain that gets the most attention from the executives at the big three. And what the big three are trying to do is anticipate which plants are going to be struck so that they can move things around so that they can keep production going. If the UAW can strike only a small number of plants, yet exact a lot of damage on the big three, then they don't have to eat into their strike fund. And so CNBC thought that they were on to the UAW. So let's play. So this clip that we're playing here was from CNBC ahead of the strike, and just roll this in all its glory.
Let's get over to Phil LeBeau live in Detroit for an update on the ongoing UAW battle. Hi, Phil.
Scott, we have received some information from a source familiar with the UAW's plans for the plants that it will plan on striking come midnight tonight if they do not reach an agreement with Ford, GM, and Stellantis. And this is our understanding of the plants that will be announced tonight. 10 o'clock is when we will get the official announcement from the UAW. Let's start first off with General Motors, Romulus Powertrain, Toledo, Ohio Propulsion, and the Marion Metal Plant in Indiana. For Ford, it's our understanding that the UAW plans to strike at the Livonia Transmission Plant, Lima, Ohio Engine Plant, and the Cleveland Engine Plant. And finally, for Stellantis, we understand that the UAW will walk out at the Kokomo Transmission Plant in Kokomo, Indiana, and the Dundee Engine Plant. We should stress, we have reached out to the UAW for confirmation that this is, in fact, is the plan. We have not heard back from the UAW.
Well, I guess it is good that he stressed they had not heard back from the UAW because, Ryan, you have a theory as to how this happened.
Well, we know that whatever the source they said that they had, this list was published in an auto trade pub earlier, and probably the auto trade pub, which has its sources in the auto industry, got it from a consultant working for one of the big three, and this big three bring in strike-breaking consultants, who then tell this is how you're going to beat this strike, and so one way or another, this consultant winds up with bogus information that winds up then with CNBC. And they should stress that they could not confirm it because every single one of those was wrong. And so what they did is that they moved things from plants that did not strike to plants that ended up striking. So at great expense to the automakers, they shut down production at a bunch of places that did not strike, moved things out of there elsewhere, and then they moved them right into the belly of a strike.
Right.
And so they created maybe hundreds of millions of damage to themselves. And it allows the UAW to keep their strike fund flush, so that, because if they were all out against all three, they might only last 3 months. That's how long the strike fund can last. Now you can go longer than that if you can, you belt tighten. That's what happened 100 years ago during these strikes. And it happens. The strike fund does not 100% replace your income. So there's it's tough to be out on strike. It's easy to be on the sidelines saying, "Hey, strike, strike, strike." It's harder to be to be the people who are actually striking. But it's harder for these executives too, if now they're accidentally shutting down their own production.
Yeah, it's like a return to the dance that everybody's out of practice, but the UAW knew that they had to be tactical and strategic about this and outsmarted the companies.
It's just amazing to watch. And this is a new UAW with Shawn Fain, the first elected president of the UAW. Like, think about that. For decades they had corrupt leaders that would be elected in these processes where there were delegates, and then the delegates would pick, and then they'd go back room. So this is finally somebody who's represented, who represents the rank and file. Came in with a militant attitude. And so his new statement is, noon on Friday, September 22nd, is a new deadline. Either the big three get down to business and work with us to make progress in negotiations, or more locals will be called to stand up and go out on strike. And so what he's saying there is that, look, CNBC, you botched it last time. You didn't know which ones we were going to strike. You don't know which ones we're going to strike this time. And more are coming if you don't come closer. And what we're hearing about the negotiations is that the numbers are already coming way up. Like the workers are doing much better. The ghost, though, of Ronald Reagan is still haunting these conversations.
Yeah, so Tim Scott was actually asked about how he would handle the strike, hypothetically, as president, and Nikki Haley was talking to Neil Cavuto on Fox News about the situation as well. Let's roll these clips for a glimpse into how some Republicans are handling the question.
I think Ronald Reagan gave us a great example when federal employees decided they were going to strike. He said, "You strike, you're fired." Simple concept to me. To the extent that we could use that once again, absolutely. The second thing I would do, though, is very important. This is probably not a well-known fact. The first thing, part of the challenge that we have today with President Biden is, and I don't mean this to be disingenuous, I mean this to be sincere. I'm not sure if the words are bought and paid for, but certainly he has been leased by the unions. And I say that because the first bill he passed, y'all remember the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package? Yeah. That only had 1% for COVID vaccines? It had $86 billion, I believe, for union pensions. Because they keep making these deals. And as a result of the deal, they promise too much, deliver too little, and the taxpayers pick up the tab.
Well, I think that's it tells you that when you have the most pro-union president and he touts that he is emboldening the unions, this is what you get. And I'll tell you who pays for it is the taxpayers. Here, from what I understand, the union is asking for a 40% raise. The companies have come back with a 20% raise. I think any of the taxpayers would love to have a 20% raise and think that's great. But, the problem is we're all going to suffer from this. This is going to cause things to go up. And, this is going to last a while. But, when you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, and this is what you get. The unions get emboldened, and then they start asking for things that, that companies have a tough time doing.
That is a bizarre take on so many levels because it actually lacks a rudimentary understanding of the dynamics at play, which is that the Biden administration set off a lot of the problems with the union that supports Democrats basically across the board, been supportive of President Biden. A lot of this is pressure that was implemented as a result of legislation that Biden's passed, executive actions on behalf of the president. And so to say that this is because Joe Biden is so cozy with unions, when in fact, actually, this is the result of serious tensions between Biden and the unions. Tensions, by the way, that Donald Trump, and I think we have this element because Shawn Fain weighed in on what Crystal and Sagar covered yesterday, Donald Trump saying, I'm skipping the second Republican debate and I'm going to talk to auto workers. Shawn Fain weighs in and he says every fiber of our union, this is a statement from Fain, is being poured into fighting the billionaire class and an economy that enriches people like Donald Trump at the expense of workers. We can't keep electing billionaires and millionaires that don't have any understanding of what it is like to live paycheck to paycheck and struggle to get by expecting them to solve the problems of the working class. Donald Trump is a departure from the Scott and Haley branch of the Republican Party, at least rhetorically. Some people might doubt that on a policy level. I think that is an entirely fair question, and we're going to be talking about it later when I discuss the plans for another corporate tax cut in a potential Trump administration. But it's kind of remarkable to hear Tim Scott and Nikki Haley invoking a public sector union strike that is different in so many ways, and I'm talking about the air traffic controllers under Ronald Reagan, is different in so many ways from what's happening with the UAW right now, just like it was a reflex, like a doctor hitting his knee. And Nikki Haley to have, I think, a completely backwards, and it didn't even seem like she was familiar with the dynamics of the strike. It's likely not going to increase prices. There's really no evidence of that at this point, at least. Strange stuff.
Right, and the politics are completely different. There's a reason that Reagan could fire the air traffic controllers, and he could get away with it. Air traffic controllers, by the way, endorsed Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
Like that, and so people, I think, might have a hard time kind of putting themselves back in that time period, but that'll help. Like, understand this. Like, this was a union that actually endorsed Ronald Reagan, and then they came in. People are going to fact check me. They either endorsed or spoke highly of him and didn't endorse the Democrats. I think they actually endorsed.
I think they endorsed
Reagan,
him,
though.
Yeah.
And then he fires them all.
Right.
But it was in this moment where there was this kind of public backlash against unions, which were getting blamed by the kind of capital class,
Volcker,
for inflation, because a lot of union contracts, and you had significant union density. And because the union contracts said that our raises rise in tandem to the cost of living being inflation, so then when the federal government would say, okay, inflation is this, then unions would get wages like that. And then because the wages went up, then the inflation number would go up, and they were getting blamed for this this vicious kind of cycle down the drain there.
Right.
But that's not happening now.
No.
We've got union density of 5 or 6%. UAW could quadruple their wages, and we're not going to see inflation as a result of that go throughout the economy. Also, the cost of labor in a car equals about 5% of the price of that car.
And it's not like UPS and Teamsters or air traffic controllers where you have basically an entire system that the country relies on shut down at the drop of a hat, which was weighing very heavily on Ronald Reagan during the strike, and he was constantly invoking that problem. Tim Scott didn't even try to make specific parallels. It was, again, it was like a reflex.
Right.
Just, Reagan.
Unions, fire them all.
Yeah, and again, Donald Trump is, whatever you think. You might think it's rhetorical. You might think it's purely strategic. Again, we're going to knock him later in the show for what he's letting his advisors tell Jeff Stein of the Washington Post, but he at least understands the dynamics, the political dynamics, whereas these guys don't even get that. I mean, they're just rehashing, trotting out canned lines. Now, maybe it's a question of whether you'd rather have a Republican Party that is transparently anti-union or a Republican Party that wants to be or is rhetorically pro-union but doesn't actually, support the union in X number of ways. I think there's a really serious issue that Donald Trump and some of the Republicans, we talked to Sohrab Ahmari about this a couple of weeks ago, are going to raise about the UAW's relationship with Democrats and the Biden administration and how the kind of green agenda causes legitimate tensions for workers. I think smart Republicans are right to be talking about those tensions, and I think some of that conversation will turn out to be good for workers. But for these Republicans to just weigh in with basically no understanding of the situation and no interest in having an understanding of the situation, Nikki Haley is using that sort of rhetoric of, it reminds me of like 2010, 2012, that worked really well in the Tea Party era, at a time when union favorability among the general public is way higher than it was then. It's not even good politics.
Yeah, and one last point on Tim Scott there. So his second piece there, he said, and if you remember the American Rescue Plan that didn't spend enough on vaccines, also that's kind of weird for a Republican primary. He said there was $86 billion, to go to union pensions. Those were miners, those were construction workers, manufacturers, factory workers, and most of those pensions went bust because private equity companies came in, bought up the companies, and liquidated the pensions. Those were contracts that were struck with the workers. The workers worked their entire lives expecting a certain payout. And also, if your pension cuts into your Social Security. So a worker who gets a certain pension gets less Social Security. So they put their whole lives into this. Private equity barons can't come in, siphon it out. They drink that milkshake. And so yes, in the American Rescue Plan, Democrats did put $86 billion into this fund to say, you know what, we're going to backstop these kind of multi-party pensions for these workers who were promised this amount, worked their whole lives for it. We've got it covered. And for Tim Scott to be like, that's the thing that I'm upset about, like, get out of here.
I think, Ryan, you might be underestimating how badly the PE dudes need that money for fleece vests and campaign checks to Tim Scott.
Like, I love the CNBC guy in his little fleece vest.
His jacket on.
Just being completely wrong and undermining the whole case that these capitalists make of that their strategic genius is why they ought to make hundreds of times more than the workers. Because they really know what they're doing. In the one case where we can test whether or not they have any idea what they're doing, the workers just completely outsmarted them.
Amazing.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.